Hi everyone, welcome again to Mentoring Developers. This is a podcast and YouTube show for you. If you are a new developer, if you want to be a developer and you really are struggling perhaps, maybe you have questions nobody answers and you're too afraid to ask them, well, here's the place. Come to the right place. And I got my good friend Burton Smith and I interviewed him very recently in episode 88, so you can check that out at mentoringdevelopers.com/episode 88, and since then we've become best friends. Hey Burton, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. So, let's quickly tell the audience what this episode is about. So the reason you're back is because you created a design system. What is that? We'll talk about what is it, and why should I care, and what it looks like, and all that good stuff. But this is for people who want to build websites or anything related to web that could be used maybe as a mobile app, perhaps. That's possible. Anything on the web can be turned into a mobile app. That's possible. But think of anything that's on the web and it has a certain look and feel, and accessibility is a problem, right? You want people to be able to access it, whether they are fully capable or partially capable. Maybe they have a problem with the eyesight or hearing or whatever else. You don't want to exclude those people. This is very, very important. So a design system will guide you. And I don't know anything about design systems, right? I'm just telling you from what I understand. So we're going to learn from the guy who created the design system. So Burton, what in the world is a design system?
That's a good question. So a design system, in a lot of ways, you can think about it as the idea of, how do we build applications? Like, what is, what processes do we follow? What coding conventions do we follow as we build and scale applications? So a design system is kind of those rules and guidelines all encapsulated into it. Now, there are a couple different parts of design systems that people sometimes get confused with. Is this a design system or part of a design system? And you hear these words a lot. So design system is just kind of this encompassing wrapper of, how do we build things and what do we use to build them? Then you have things like component libraries, and those are, code blocks, code snippets, pieces of components or reusable code that you can use throughout your application to create consistency and, a unified user experience. And then, on the other hand, you hear this term called style guides. And style guides, those are kind of like the specific implementation of a design system. So a lot of companies have a design system for a single brand, and that's why sometimes those get confused, because the design system only correlates with a single brand, so it has a single style guide, and so they kind of look and feel the same. But you have other companies that have multiple brands. So they have one design system, but then they have multiple brands that they apply that design system to, and they use different style guides to document how the design system gets implemented for that brand. So there's kind of these moving parts. Design systems, this big wrapper, it kind of communicates how you build things. The component library or pattern library is the reusable components and reusable parts of it. And then the style guide is how does your brand implement that specific design system for that given brand. So really, the goal behind a design system is to build efficiency with the way you build things so that you reuse as much code as possible throughout your applications, and as well as create a system of quality and abstraction that allows you to make it easier to implement code practices, good coding practices, but also make it easy for users to use your applications because it has a consistent look and feel.
Yeah, this was great. A design system allows you to be consistent because if you are a company that you want the user to have a known experience, if you go to a Coke website, you should see a lot of red. I think a shade of red. If you go to Pepsi, you should see a lot of blue, right? So, because people associate those elements with that particular brand. So that's good, but also consistency is good for anybody. You don't want to have 2 pages of a website look completely different, for example. And the cool thing about what you're doing is you're trying to promote accessibility. So that's why. So there are design systems, and there are design systems, right? Your design system. Why does it need to exist? Aren't there already design systems?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because there are some great design systems out there, and people are already, especially if you're a web developer, are familiar with a lot of these, like Bootstrap, Foundation, Material Design by Google. You get all of these really awesome design systems out there that a lot of people are very familiar with already, and they do a very good job of making their tools easy to use and implement their styles and designs. The challenge that I ran into, and actually the reason why I started this project in the first place, was because we have, like I said, we have in the company that I work for, we have multiple brands, and each of those brands is on a different platform and uses a different technology, and so some of them use a front-end framework, some of them don't use a front-end framework. And so it gets very difficult to say, okay, how do we implement a design system, a consistent design system across the board for all of our technologies? That's a very difficult question to ask. And so the thing that I looked into was, okay, I know Vue.js, I know a little bit of React. Can I use those and create a library and plug them in? Well, if I use Vue here, I can't use Vue there because of this library, and they compete with each other. There was all of these things that I just started running into problems with it that made it difficult to create a standard library to use. And then I stumbled across this compiler called Stencil.js. And Stencil.js is made by the Ionic team. If you don't know what Ionic is, it's a way of writing mobile applications in web technology. So you write it in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it compiles down into mobile applications. Really cool technology. And what they did is they built this compiler that takes your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it compiles it to standards-based web components. And web components they've been part of the HTML5 spec for a while, like a long time. Unfortunately, they just never got a lot of love. A lot of the front-end frameworks that were available were providing a lot of the same features and a lot of the same capabilities. And so they just didn't get a lot of attention early on. Well, now more and more companies like mine, where they have multiple frameworks across the board who need to find a way to be able to consistently implement design systems, are looking at these web components because they're framework agnostic. It doesn't matter what framework you're using. You can implement it anywhere, even if you're not using a framework. It's part of the HTML5 standard. And so this compiler, Stencil.js, what it does is it compiles down your components down into just raw HTML components. And I'll show you what that looks like here in a minute and why that's so cool. But it also gives you the ability to have really performant applications because they don't need a framework in order to generate your UI. When I start building with my components, as I'll show you in a minute, you don't have to have React or Angular or Vue or any of those libraries to be able to use these components. It just is part of the DOM spec, and it can. So it's very fast and very lightweight as well.
So can it work with all these components? If all these libraries, like React has its own components and Angular has its own components, because they just do, and they are not interoperable. But if I create a page using your design system, then I'll be using web components. We're saying we're going to talk about what those are. If you're clueless, if you're listening right now and you're like, what is a component? I don't get it. We'll talk about this. Don't worry. So, yeah. But I have this web component, right? Mm-hmm. But now I want to have something else. Maybe something that I really like React for something and I just want to add that. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't clash with each other, right?
Correct. And you're absolutely right. So the nice thing is that using web components, you can use them just like HTML elements, right? Just like an input element or a button element. You use your component just like that. And React and these other frameworks look at them and treat them similar to that. Now, I will say React has kind of doesn't have the best reputation with components, and so there are some gotchas when it comes to React and web components. In Kickstand, in the framework that I built, I'm aware of those, and I've built the framework knowing that those issues exist. So hopefully you don't have to worry about that while you're building things. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, many of the frameworks play very well with web components and work, seamlessly with them. So yeah, it's a very nice experience. You're right on the money. So you're absolutely right. So part of the reason why there wasn't a lot of love for components early on is because browser support wasn't great. Well, it's come a long way since then. Browsers have really advanced a lot and picked up a lot of the features for supporting components. Now, components themselves, just like you said, they encapsulate, markup, logic, state, styles into a single unit, right? A single cohesive unit. So, for example, a modal component. A modal component is not something that's native to the HTML spec right now. I mean, there's a dialog component. Let's just take that off the table for a second. But so let's say I wanted to create a pop-up modal that would show when a user does something. That doesn't natively exist. So I now need to create markup to be able to display that and give it styles and give it functionality using JavaScript to make it show and hide and whatever other functionality I need to have in there. I want to be able to encapsulate that into a component so that I can reuse it throughout the site easily and create consistency. So that way, it's not difficult for developers and content creators to use modals throughout the site, but also I want to be able to make sure that all of the necessary elements get encapsulated in there, like accessibility, so that when someone else comes along who may not be as knowledgeable about accessibility, they don't have to know all that stuff to be able to implement a modal. It's contained within my component. They just use my component and implement it, and they already get that goodness out of the component itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take you over to the library that I created, or the design system I created, is called Kickstand UI. So I'm going to go ahead and show the website. It's kickstand-ui.com is where the documentation is. And I'm going to take you through just the basic quick start to show you how easy it is to start building with components, to start building with Kickstand itself. So on the quick start page, here I have a couple of links, and this is served from the CDN, so there's nothing you have to install, there's nothing you have to do to get these in your application other than copy these links and paste them into an HTML page. So if you look here, we have our styles here, that's our first one, and then you'll see that we have two script tags. And there's a reason for that. The first script tag, if you can see, actually I'll zoom in a little bit here so you can see a little bit better. You'll see that it says type equals module. And then the second script tag says no module. And the reason for that is that this supports ES modules. And what that means is that if you are using an evergreen or a modern browser, it's going to lazy load in the components as you use them. So right now in the Kickstand library, there's quite a few components and elements that are available to you that you can take advantage of. The nice thing about Kickstand is that, and this is a benefit of using Stencil, is that it lazy loads them. So if I never use the carousel component, it's not going to load the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for the carousel component. It's only going to load what I need. which is really, really nice, and it makes it really efficient. And the other thing is it makes it easier for you to incrementally adopt the design system. So if you already have a website or an existing application and you want to start introducing a new design system into it, rather than rewrite the whole thing from scratch from the start, sometimes it's easier to start introducing it a piece at a time. So first, let's start with some buttons. Then we'll start with a carousel. Then we'll start with the accordions. And then you go through and you can kind of a piece at a time assimilate the site to a new design system rather than do a complete rewrite all at once. So here I'm just going to grab all three of these links and I'm going to paste them into just a regular HTML document. I have one prepared here. I'll zoom in so you can see what I'm doing. And there's nothing fancy, it's just an index.html. Actually, I'll even go ahead and hide that sidebar because there is nothing fancy happening in there. So I'm going to go ahead and just add.
And
right
you're just
below.
You're just in a text editor right now.
Yep, this is Visual Studio Code. You can do it in any text editor you want to, Sublime, Notepad, whatever you want. You can you can do this. It's just a regular file called index.html, and I've added some boilerplate HTML document here.
There's nothing in the body, and you're just going to add the CSS and the JavaScript from the website here. The website looks great, by the way.
Well, thank you. Let's see. So I just added them to the head. You can add the scripts to the footer if you to the bottom of the body if you want, wherever you want to place them. But I'll just put them in one place right now so it stays consistent. And I'm just going to add in here just an H1 tag that says "Hello World." Save, and then I'm going to go. Actually, I'm going to open this in my browser, just the file. I'm not running it on a server or anything. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go Reveal in Finder, and I'm just going to double click that so it opens up in my browser. There we are, Hello World. And I know it worked because it's using my default colors here. I can tell already. Now, this is where things start to get a little bit fun, right? So I'm going to introduce two components in here. I'm going to introduce a button component and a modal component. And I know what you're thinking, wait, we already have a button component. Why do we need another button component? Well, that's because mine has some extra treats in it. So I have a KS button. All right. So that's just my regular KS is a prefix for kickstand, just so that it doesn't get confused with the DOM elements.
Right.
And then I'm going to add open modal. And right below it, I'm going to add a KS-modal element. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a title. I'm going to say modal title equals test modal. And then in the body, I'm just going to add hello again. So basically 3 lines of code right here, nothing fancy going on. Now, the only thing that I need to do now is I need to tell my button which modal to open. So I'm just going to give my modal an ID. This is a regular HTML ID, nothing crazy here. So test modal. And I have a special property on here called shows. And there are a couple of the components that have show and hide behavior in here. And so I've created a shortcut in my button component so I can just say shows or hides, and it will control the behavior. So I'm going to say shows. What's that?
That's nice. That's nice because it's very. This reads like English. You could have chosen a different name. I think this is brilliant. I've seen other components or other libraries use visible, which is fine, but shows is better.
Thanks. Yeah, I thought it made it easier too. And I'll explain kind of why I did that the way I did here in a second. But now if I go back to the browser and I refresh this page, there's my button. Now if I click on my button, hey,
Nice.
That's all I had to do to implement a modal on my page. 3 lines, no, not only that, 2 lines of HTML. I didn't have to write any JavaScript. I didn't have to do any CSS. I now have a modal set up in here.
That's nice. And it shows up in the button colors are what decided for you, or is it like a...
Yeah, so there are some preset colors in here. Now, the cool thing is that knowing that we have multiple brands in our company that we need to be able to customize this design system for, we set up a way to update and create that. Not only do we have multiple brands, but we have customer branded sites as well within a site. So we need to have a way that as a customer comes into the site, it needs to identify who they are and update the brand colors according to what their brand colors are. So it needs to be very flexible in terms of being able to be customized to whatever brand we need to apply to. Mm-hmm. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and inspect. So I just did right click and I inspected the window here, and it's going to open up my developer panel, and I believe I can zoom in here. Yes, nice. And so what I have, I'm going to click on my HTML element here, and it's going to show me the root element, which is basically the HTML element. And if you look in here, you'll see all of these --.ks elements here. And what this is these are CSS variables. And what that means is that these can be reused, and this is a CSS3 feature, kind of more modern feature. Not all browsers have support for this, but I went ahead and in Kickstand polyfilled that, so you don't have to worry about it. We support back to IE11. So if you're using IE11, which does not support CSS variables, don't worry, we've polyfilled that for you, so you don't have to worry about support for that.
People who don't understand polyfill is, so while you're doing this, let me explain. A polyfill is a piece of JavaScript that does something similar to what maybe a more modern version of JavaScript will do. So I had to do that in projects where I was building something for a very, very antiquated device on a very small handheld kind of footprint, and it was using a very, very old version of IE, but I wanted to use JavaScript, and a lot of the functions just weren't implemented in that version. So now as you can use it, you can actually take another implementation that works everywhere, so you could build on top of that. That way your API can stay clean, and you don't have to put all of that if-else kind of thing in your code that's using it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. I mean, that's amazing, and since you've done that, that's amazing, and it sounds like a lot of work. I'm super impressed. But yeah, okay. Yes. If you're watching right now, or you're not excited, I don't understand you. You should be excited. I am excited.
Yeah, it's we I tried really hard to make sure that whatever developers need, it would help fill those gaps for not only developers, and this comes back to why I made this look the way it did, or the way I wrote the properties, and you said, hey, it reads like English, and I'm glad you noticed that, because I tried to go out of my way to do that. And the reason why is because developers are not always the developers that have code editors, and what I mean by that is that content authors need to be able to implement code as well, right? So we have content management platforms. People use WordPress, people use Joomla or a Sitecore, whatever it is. Like, there are all different kinds of content management platforms, and sometimes content authors don't have access to JavaScript or CSS. They only have access to the components that have been set up within that content management platform and a rich text editor, right? That's usually what they have access to. So I wanted to be able to create a way that was easy for content authors to also create rich experiences. So they could easily add this button, and they could add a modal in their content without ever having to touch HTML, without ever having to touch CSS or JavaScript. So the idea is that developers need to be able to use this easily and implement this easily, but so do content creators, because they a lot of times are the implementers of these design systems, and they need to have the tools available to them to make it easy for them.
I think this is amazing. Good stuff. All right, let's keep going.
Yeah. So now that I have these elements on here, and I already talked about how these are like HTML elements, and I'll show you how. And this is kind of something that I really enjoy about working with components. Is I now have access to all of their properties and all of their exposed methods, just like I would with regular HTML elements. And so, for example, my button here. So right now, I'm just using the default button. What I can do is I can grab this button. So I'm going to go to my console, and I'm going to say document dot query selector, and I'm going to grab my button here. Oh, whoops! Actually, before I do that, sorry. I'm going to set that to a variable. I'm going to say const equals const button equals document query selector, and I'm going to grab that button. I'm just going to say KS, grab my KS button element. Luckily, I only have one on the page, so it won't be that confusing. I'm going to assign it to that button. Now, if I just type in button, you'll see that I have that element selected, and it shows me that I have this. Now, what I can do is not only do I have access to the properties of the button, but the browser recognizes their properties. So what I have is I actually get autocomplete from the browser, which is kind of slick. So I can go button, and I know there's a property on here to determine the color. So I'm going to say button.color, so you can see it's already got all of my other properties on here. I can say color equals, I want my secondary color. And it changed it to my secondary color there.
Nice.
Now I want it to be a hollow button. So I'm going to say hollow. That's where it's outlined and it's got a white background. And I'm going to say hollow is true. Oh, maybe I spelled it wrong. Whoops. No, hollow equals true. Oh. That's why. Sorry, I changed that in the most recent version. I'm going to say display equals
hollow.
There we go. And now I have a hollow button.
Nice.
So I have access to that element through the JavaScript and through the DOM, but I also can go back to my markup and add those properties on there as well. So I can go back into my markup, and on my button, I can say display equals hollow, and I could say what was the other thing we did?
Secondary color.
Oh yeah, that's right. Thank you. Color equals secondary. And then this is the same thing, right? So I can set it through, I can access it and set it through JavaScript. I can also set it and access it directly in the markup here. Now, the other thing that's cool is I have the ability to expose methods. And so in here, let's say I select my modal. I'm just going to say modal. Now I know on my modal I have a couple methods that can be displayed, the shows and the hides, right? Mm-hmm. The show and hide. So I can say modal dot, and you can see them here already, show. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to execute that method, and it shows my modal. So I don't have to import a service. I don't have to have a utility or anything like that. I just select the element and I execute the method on that element, which is really nice. And it helps keep my code very clean. So there's a lot of capabilities that come with having and accessing web components versus other components throughout the application. And this is, it's been really awesome to be able to have access to that and build applications with it, because one, it's very performant, and two, it's consistent, right? As we go from one environment to another, you always know how you access the modal. You always know how you access the button and implement a button. And so whether I'm doing it in a React application, or whether I'm doing it in a Vue application, or whether I'm doing it in an ASP.NET application, it's always going to be the same. I always have the same APIs available to me, and it's going to be consistent, which is fantastic.
I think this is great. Even someone like me can make good-looking websites now.
Yeah.
I really want to check it out. I'm like, okay, I could be the cool guy who uses design systems. Nobody else with, you know, I'm a consultant, so I work in a lot of different projects. A lot of times they're big corporate projects. And we don't use design systems. So
yeah, and it gets messy real fast, right?
Yeah. So, but it's good. But it's good that if something is easy, then it's an easier sell for someone like me to go to somebody and say, you know, we should use a design system, or we should use a better, you know, we should have a better user experience. But if it involves a big learning curve and everybody has to be trained and you have to buy this tool and it is too difficult, and most people just don't want to do it. So if you make it easy, if you make it free, which I think it's free, right?
Yeah,
you don't charge people. Yeah. Do you spy on people? Do you have like a little spying code over there? Keylogger or something like that? Nothing?
Maybe next time.
In the next version, maybe.
Yeah.
All right, good.
You're absolutely right. And one of my favorite quotes, so Sparkbox, local company here, Ben Callahan, who's the owner of that, really, really awesome guy, in a recent interview, he said, when talking about design systems, he said, you know, a company that they were working with was working on a design system, and they noticed that a lot of money was going into this thing called a design system. And they said, well, wait, what's the investment here? Why are we investing so much in a design system? And they said, okay, well, let's figure out what the ROI is for that. And, you know, what's the return on investment? How much money are we actually saving or earning by using a design system? And they, after doing the digging and the research, they came back and said, looks like for every $1 we're spending on the design system is saving us $3 on design and development effort.
Wow.
So just that, I mean, if that's not a good argument for upper management and those bean counters, I don't know what is, because that is, you know, wonderful savings in terms of efficiency that it brings to the team. So absolutely, design systems help streamline a lot of that effort and make, you know, the tools accessible and available to everyone. So
that's awesome. Yeah. Okay, what else can we make? So we can make modals. What is there anything else, maybe a little bit more complicated, that we can make with Kickstand?
Oh yeah, let's see. We can do. Let's see. We have so many components available. We have icons. So we have an icon library available. You don't have to use it. It doesn't pull them in if you don't use them. So there's icons available if you need some basic icons. Images, we have components that support lazy loading for images. So if you are trying to really make your site more performant, you want to lazy load that content until that actually shows up in the viewport. You can use the KS image and add the lazy tag on there. You can also control the threshold, which means how soon before it actually gets to the viewport, it loads into the DOM. So you can have it load sooner or later and have it seem seamless to the user that there was ever an image, that there was never an image there in the first place. It could load before. Just
to be clear, the reason you're doing this is because you don't want to hold up loading the page, because images could be large, and HTML is just text. So it's very fast to show the page, but then there are images here and there. And then if you just have to wait, then on a slow connection, that could be a problem. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like what you're saying is that you're going to create a space for that. You're going to tell the DOM that there is an image without actually being there, so that it flows the text around. Because what used to happen in the 90s, when I first started using the web, was that you know your page would so your text will load, and then it will just flop around, and then everything would change because something else loaded and what's happening here? So
it still does that. If you ever get on some of those blog sites and wait for all the ads to load and things shift around, and you go to click on one thing and things shifted, and you click on something else. So that's.
So is that kind of what you're doing here? So I'm trying to understand what lazy loading exactly means in the context of an image.
Yep, absolutely. You nailed it. So it creates a placeholder in the DOM, so in the web page itself, and once it gets close to the viewport, before the user actually sees it, it's going to load the image before it gets there, just at real time when they actually access
So
it.
a viewport, for people who don't know, is that a page may be very, very long. It may actually not fit entirely on your screen. So a viewport in this case, I think what you mean by that is what you can actually see at this moment. And when you load a page, you'll just see the top. So why load the bottom? Why waste time and make the browser do a lot of work to load things that the user cannot even see? But when the user is scrolling up, then at that point you can say, "Oh, we got to show this now." But so at that time, are we fetching the image, or the image is already in there, but we're not? It's already fetched.
It's fetching the image, so it's gonna pull the image in
on demand as you scroll.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, that's pretty cool. That could make for a very fast, loading time, especially on slow connections. And a lot of times, if you go to a lot of websites, you just want to go to the top menu. So why load the rest of the page? Cool.
Yeah, exactly.
It happens a lot to me because, I may go to a news website. I tend to go to a lot of those. And I usually just want to go to the menu at the top and actually select the section I want to go to. But then if you, web design needs to, it's not exactly a science. It's an art. And we haven't really mastered it as an industry, but design systems can definitely help us sort of make good decisions without having to think about it, which I think is the best part.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so there's like I said, there's a lot of different components set up in here that are available to do help build out a rich application for you and give you the tools you need. One thing that I do want to show you is forms and how forms work, because there's a lot of built-in features into the forms and form validation that hopefully save developers a ton of time. One thing that has been the focus of developing this framework has been, what can we leverage that already exists in the DOM? What do we have that the browser is already giving us that we can leverage to give us, the features that we're building? I can't even tell you how many times I've seen someone recreate required validation, right? To make a field required, they go through and write all this JavaScript to see if it's the value exists or not, when in fact the browser gives us that information anyway. There's nothing fancy we really have to do to take advantage of that. So the form and form field components, and these are the two main components. The rest of these are just variations of those. So we have spin boxes, autocomplete components that give us, search capabilities, things like that. These are all just sub features of the form and form fields. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab this default form that's here. And if you look, so you'll see that, this item is required. There's a little asterisk here. There's an email input, and it's got some bad text in here. Oh, you see it's already starting to validate as I leave the field. But also when I submit, it'll give me feedback as well. Well, I'm going to grab this code, and I'm going to show you how it works and what we get when we do form validation. So I'm going to go back to my editor. And I'm just going to go below this content here, and I'm going to paste this demo code in. And so all I have here is I have a form, a KS form, and that's basically a wrapper for an HTML form element with a couple of extra features with it. And then we have two form fields. One is a required, just a text field. The other one is a type of email. And we have a default value set up in there. And then we have a submit button using our trusty KS button element. Now, what I'm going to do is just out of the box, there's nothing fancy happening here. There's no HTML no CSS or JavaScript that I had to write. I get the validation for free. So if I go back here and I refresh my page, I'm going to go ahead and shrink this down a little bit, and I click submit. It does the validation for me automatically, and it gives me the feedback based on, excuse me.
It's time to go to bed, Burton.
Well, actually, it's time to move the elf on the shelf. So, hopefully my kids aren't listening to this. I shouldn't have said that. So it's going to give me feedback based on what I've asked that field to do. So this, all I had was the type is email. It's going to do the email validation for me. Here I have, what I just indicated that it was a required field. It's going to do that required validation for me. Now the cool thing too, so this will give feedback to the user. Now as a developer, I also need to know that information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh the page to reset the form. And I'm going to select this form, and I'm going to show you how I can access that form data. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to set up a variable, const equals const form equals document query selector. And I'm just going to grab my KS form element. So now what I'm going to do is on the form element, I have an event emitter set up so that when something happens, it's going to emit, it's just going to broadcast a message. And I'll show you what that message is here in a second. So I'm going to listen for that event. And if I look at my documentation here, I scroll down, you'll see the event that I have set up is called submitted. And I'll show you how to listen for that. So I'm going to say form dot add event listener. And that event listener is submitted. And then I'm going to have a callback method here. The method's going to fire when that event fires. And I'm just going to log it to the console for right now. So I'm going to say console.log. And I'm going to log that event data to the console. So all I'm saying is, okay, take that event data, log it to the console, and we'll take a look at it. I'll show you what we get. So now I'm going to go submit my form. Boom, and there's our custom event right there. So now I'm going to expand this, and I'm going to go down to the details section. The details section is where the custom data is coming back from the form. And here I'm going to say, okay, so here's the field data for the form. Here we have the name and the email, and then it's going to give me the value. So here it's going to say is valid, is false, so it's not valid. The value is undefined because there's nothing there, and then it's going to give me all this validity information. It's going to tell me, did it match the pattern? You can define regular expression to say, does it match a certain pattern? Is it too big or is it too small? Is it too long or too short? Is it the right type? Is the value missing? So it's going to give you a lot of that validation data. The funny thing is this comes from the browser. I didn't do this. I just happened to pass it along to you. The browser gives you that information, and we're just adding that to our experience so that it gives you more information on what's valid and what's coming back from your form. So it's also going to say, whether or not the form itself is valid. So these are, sorry, let me scroll back up here. The validity state. So these are my two elements on the form, whether or not it's valid. It's going to tell you how many items are in there, and whether or not the form itself is valid. It'll tell you whether each field is valid, but it will give you an overall form validity. That way, when you get it back, you can say, is the form valid? Yes or no, do this if it is, do that if it's not, etc. And so it helps the developer without having to go through and look at things individually and sort things out. It just gives you that response back, and you can act accordingly pretty quickly. So there's a lot of this stuff that comes from the browser, and we've just added some additional features around it to try to enhance it and make developer lives easier.
This is amazing. This message at the end, you don't have to add a control for that. That is just built in to the form control.
This is built into the form control, and you can specify this form message. So if you don't like one or more of the blah, 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 if that's not a good message for you, or if you need that to be translatable, let's say you're working with international localization and you need to have it be translatable, you can pass in different values into the form, the KS form element to that global error message, as well as these individual error messages. These are all customizable.
Okay. So let me ask you this question. As we're coming to, we're trying to wrap up this demo. There's so much to talk about in this. So maybe we'll get into, other aspects of it, and maybe some real world examples if you get a chance in a future episode. But in this one, I just want to wrap it up because I'm trying to understand this. This is fantastic. I can go in there and just quickly create elements without having to know exactly how to do them, and know that a certain standard functionality will work, which is brilliant. But why is this accessible? Because that's where we started, right? We wanted something accessible. Why is this more accessible than using something else?
Yeah, so... And it's not necessarily more accessible. So I built this to be accessible. I've gone out of my way to really make sure that there are accessible elements, and that we're following, best practices around usability and things like that. Other component libraries do that too. I won't act like it's the best one out there or that the other ones aren't doing a good job, because they are. They're great. There are some that do a great job. There are some that do not, though. They look very pretty and they look very nice, and they don't do a very good job. So one of the things that we within our company need to be aware of is that we work internationally. We build applications internationally, and they have different standards outside of the United States that they're more strict with their accessibility standards. So we need to make sure that we're developing for higher accessibility standards than what unfortunately, United States has identified as the minimum accessibility standards. So the goal always is to try to get the best accessibility, not just good enough accessibility. So one thing that, we use different tools to evaluate the accessibility level of the different components and how they interact with each other. Lighthouse is a great tool that's built into the browser. You can see if you're using Chrome or a Chromium-based browser, Lighthouse is built in, and you can have it do an accessibility audit for you.
Nice.
Another great one that I really enjoy is Accessibility Insights for the Web, and I'm hovering over the icon here in the browser, and that's by Microsoft, and they have Chrome extensions for it. And this one is very nice because it's very visual. Chrome will give you just a kind of a score and give you a list of things you need to look at. This one will actually give you a score and a list, and then it will overlay the results over the website itself and say, this button does not have enough contrast, or this form field is missing a certain ARIA attribute. And it'll give you a much more visual feedback of what's missing, or what needs work. So we try to, when I go through and build components, I try to test them against different standards. Also, in my test environment, I use Storybook, and I use Storybook's accessibility plugin, so that as I'm building it, it's giving me real-time feedback as, oh, you're missing this, or this is the wrong attribute or role that is being assigned to this. And so, I try to spread it out and make sure that I have my bases covered. And, if someone goes in and sees an accessibility problem, please tell me about it, because that's really important to me that this is accessible and that the web is accessible. So, yes, please let me know.
For the uninitiated, the main thing that I think accessibility is concerned with is screen readers, because if you're not able to see something that's fancy, but if you can't actually see it, maybe you have a visual impairment or something like this, your screen reader should be able to actually read the names of the fields and should be able to get any error messages, right? So if everything is an image, then it's hard for the screen reader to know what that means. And if you have images, then you should have descriptions in the alt tag, right? Things like that. Just common sense things that we have over the years, we have learned that, not just the sighted people visit our website, and the unsighted people, or people who have difficulty actually reading your tiny fonts, they have a right to use your system as well. So if you're out there and if you're thinking, okay, I don't know anything about it, just try using a screen reader on your whatever your program is, and see if that actually works.
Another great test is, screen readers. Visually impaired is one area that definitely is a big one. The other one is keyboard users.
Yeah.
So how accessible is your site for keyboard users? Can your users see where they're actually at in here? So one of the things that we added is an outline. So as you tab through, you'll see it in outline with this dotted border, so that you can see where your place is within the application. And anyone can test that, right? You don't have to pull up any new technology, and all you have to do is start tabbing through and see how usable is this from a keyboard user experience. And everyone at some point or another is a keyboard, or at the very least a one-handed user when they've got food in their hand, right?
Or babies, or both,
or their mouse with only one hand when they've got food. And so happen, it's accessibility, and I like what you said about it, but it's also so much more, right? Accessibility is just making it easier to use for everyone. And it doesn't have to be like a permanent disability. It doesn't have to mean you're blind. It just means maybe at that time, maybe you broke your hand and you can't use it for a few weeks. Right. You're a one-handed keyboard user. That you realize how inaccessible things are when you're all of a sudden lose something that you depend on. Yeah. So there's just so many things that you have to think about when building applications that can make it hard. So for example, with the modal, and this is something that I didn't think about until I actually started building a modal, is you need to have keyboard trapping set up in there so that as they start tabbing, so right now when you open the modal, it sets the focus on the close button. I can't, as I tab, if there were more selectable elements in here, it would tab through those selectable elements, but it wouldn't leave the modal. That way, if I'm tabbing, it doesn't start going out to these input fields and things like that. It stays contained in my modal where I want them to focus. I never ever thought about that until I actually built a modal, and I was like, "Oh yeah, that's a good idea. That's really important. That makes sense." So it's just things that you don't think about that make a big difference for users, all of your users. So it's important.
Yeah, this is amazing stuff. Is there anything else you want to show, or do you want to wrap up?
That's probably a good start. If someone wants to get in there and try it out, that's probably the easiest, fastest, low risk way to do it. Yeah. Maybe another time I can come in and show you how to integrate it into an existing system or an existing build pipeline if you're using Webpack or Rollup or something like that. How do we integrate it into an existing application and get it going? So.
And we can just build something quickly. Let's see if we can build something in 30 minutes or 40 minutes using Kickstand. I have an idea. We'll collaborate. We'll screen share, and we'll let the world know how amazing, how horrible of a developer I am, and how amazing you are. We'll do it. We'll do it next time. We'll do it another time.
It'd be fun. I love it.
I am curious to see how inaccessible my website is. If you go to mentoringdevelopers.com, I want to see, because I've never tried it, but I keep getting these messages from Google telling me that my site is not very good for mobile. How inaccessible am I?
Good question. So there's a couple of things we can do. So obviously you can see that it's not using HTTPS. I don't know if that's just because I need.
That's just because I'm lazy. I don't have an SSL cert.
Oh, okay.
But I really need to get one.
So that's that'll be a big boost, not only for just users, but also SEO. Absolutely. They look at that a lot now. But so one thing we could do, let's this is what I do normally when I go into a site, because I'm super nosy. So I go into a site and I say, okay, let's generate a Lighthouse report.
Oh, it's going to be bad.
So this is an easy one because again, it's built into the browser, so anyone can run this. If you have a Chromium-based browser, so this is Microsoft Edge that I'm using, which is now Chromium-based. Hey, look at that, super good performance, not bad SEO. Accessibility and best practices. So let's look at accessibility. Got a 72 on that. It's going to say role does not have the required ARIA tags. So the volume slider, okay. So I'm probably on one of your players. Yeah, the volume slider doesn't have the right roles. Let's see.
See, that was just gibberish to me. I have no idea what that means. This is a plugin that it's a WordPress site. So I have no idea how they implemented it, but also I don't know what a role is.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So a role is basically, so there's the ARIA spec, right? Accessible, rich interface applications. I don't remember what ARIA stands for. I butchered that, I'm sure. But basically, setting a role on something is a way of telling the browser that an element is something other than what it actually is. So, for example, I could have a div, and I could put role equals button, and the browser will think that div is a button now. Don't do that. Please don't use, if anyone's listening, do not use a div as a button. Please use the button element because it comes with a lot of those built-in features that you want. But you can basically, it's a way of specifying what something is other than it is. So right now this is a span element, but it's having it, it's telling it the role is actually a slider. So it wants a browser to think that this span is a slider. So it looks like Lighthouse is telling us that roles do not have all required. So it's missing ARIA elements. So there's different ARIA elements that go with roles to say whether it's selected or opened or different the states or different information, so that screen readers or assistive technologies can look at and interpret it. What's happening with what's in the DOM, right? Because you're telling it the role is a slider. Now it's missing an ARIA attribute to say, okay, what's going on with that slider? What's the details about that slider that someone should know as they're going through the DOM. So it could be something like a role. It could be something like how far or how complete is it, the slider? Yeah. What percentage of it is it filled? It could be lots of different things. Yeah.
So I think this will have to be implemented at the plugin level because it could be dynamic. Like I couldn't just fix it, but something to look at certainly.
Yeah.
There might be other replacements available.
Yeah. So there's other things, the HTTPS, which we talked about, cross-origin destinations are unsafe. So this is just best practice information, for your information. Now, if I go back here and I run, hey, there's Kevin right there. So if I run the accessibility insights for web, what this is going to do is I'll just do a fast pass. It'll open up a new browser page to tell me, okay, here's all the results back. This one's a little more detailed, right? It'll go through and actually give you feedback and say, here's where it is. It'll give you links to information, more detailed information about what the error is and why it's happening. And then here's what I was talking about before, is it'll go back and it'll give you overlay information. So it has, it didn't do it for this one. Or maybe it couldn't find those elements to add it. A lot of times it'll add red rectangles around whatever the problem areas are to give you more information about how to fix them and where it's actually happening. Because sometimes just looking at, when you're, especially if you're a non-technical person and you get a list like this, you're like, I have no idea what that means. I don't know where any of these elements are or why it's behaving this way. When you go back and you can see it visually and see where the issues are, it's much easier to address them then. Yeah. So they can go to the Kickstand site, kickstand-ui.com. I'm constantly trying to to add new things there and build new things. I just let out a new release today, 2.1. So hopefully some bugs and new features. Bugs got fixed, new features got added. So hopefully people can take advantage of that. And you can follow me at LinkedIn and look me up. There's not very many Burton Smiths out there. And feel free to connect with me. And you can also follow me on Twitter, and I'm at Stuffbreaker. So, and I try to post regularly to both of those environments around development, accessibility, UX, UI, a lot of those things, design systems. So if you're into those things, feel free to follow me or send me your cool stuff. I love checking out new tools, so feel free to. All right, thank you.